Hello, I'm Sam, a second year extended diploma student, and this video has two parts. The first part, I'm going to give you an overview of the marking criteria, and in the second part, I'm going to show you my sketchbooks to show you how I've put that into practice. And at the moment, you might be thinking marking criteria, that's the most boring thing on the planet, and you're right. But part of the reason that it's the most boring thing on the planet is because the guy who wrote it is a dipstick, and I'm going to be trying to keep dipstickery to a minimum. So instead of their 8 criteria, I'm going to simplify it to research, plan, make, and reflect, which overlaps with their 7 categories, but I find this easier to remember. And speaking of remembering, remember that they can't mark what you don't show them. So if you think a thought, put it in a sketchbook, submit it in the sketchbook, because you don't always know what's important, and they will think that everything is important. For instance, in this sketchbook, I wrote what my favourite line in the movie Psycho was, and despite me thinking that was irrelevant at the time, now as my work has progressed, the idea of performance has become more and more important an aspect, so it's nice to see an early version of my interest, from weeks ago. So to move on to the first category, research, I would recommend only talking about things that you're interested in. And interest doesn't mean you like them, but if you do like them, that's nice to hear, and why you like them. But then also things that you really hate, you have a strong emotional reaction to, those are the kind of things that I talk about the most. And the reason that I write the most about the things that I'm interested in is because I have things to say about them, whereas I don't have things to say about things that I'm not interested in. And it's that sort of subjective appreciation of art that is the most important thing at this stage of learning. Roland Barthes separates specifically photographs, but art into 2 ways of experiencing them. One is studium and the other is punctum, and studium is the historical context of it, the intent of the artist. You should always include the date of birth, but the sort of academic side of art history, that's studium. And then punctum, which I'm more interested in, and I think so should everyone else be, is how it viscerally impacts you and how it emotionally affects you, what pulled you into the work, what pushed you out of it, why does a work exist in you in the way that it does. And then, admittedly, studium is a part of punctum, because when you are talking about, let's say, Picasso, you might say that his style came from Africa, and I might say, well, I'm more interested in how time is fractured in his work, and that came from Cézanne. And you always get these spiraling lineages of ideas, but the idea that you choose to pluck out of a work of art, that's you, that's punctum, that's interesting, you should write that down. And the reason that writing down what you think is very useful is because they get an idea of who you are as a person by what you decide to pull out of a work, but then also you get a greater understanding of how you engage with art. And that's actually why reproducing a work of art, you see a work of art and then you decide to draw it, the different ways in which you approach that work of art will show them who you are as a person, how you are as an artist, as well as you get a better understanding of a picture by drawing it than you ever could by eternally thinking about it. For example, this work of art I've drawn entirely differently from this work of art, even though they are both reproductions by me. Each one comes with a different sort of design ideology, and from that they can draw what you actually think, what you genuinely believe. I think reproducing work is one of the most valuable things that you can do as an artist. And, it helps the people marking your work, mark it more efficiently, because a picture's worth 1,000 words and all that. You can show them what you're thinking rather than telling them what you're thinking. And even if you don't think you're showing them, they might be able to read into it stuff that you couldn't put there. And that's cool. And then planning, kind of boring, kind of necessary. I personally, I don't think that you can make something good without planning, but I know that other people think that your work as it goes along is the plan. So even if you don't want to plan anything out beforehand, if you record everything that you're doing and then go, and I might do this, I might do that, that's also planning, and that's also good. The reason why I like planning and like documenting stuff in general is because I quite like these sketches and these sketches, but the piece of art that they turned into, I hate it, which means that because I've got this as a reference, as a document, I know where my good idea went terribly, and if I needed to, I could go back and rejig it from my last wonky turning off point from the perfect idea plan. Explain your thought process so you understand your own thought process better. Write it down so that you can get points for it, I guess. And then the make category is fairly self-explanatory, but because you need to make things, but as well as that, I'm including like experimentation, because you get points for like working in different mediums, which admittedly, if you have been following my advice and you're copying the artist that you like's work, and researching broadly so that you get a better pool of ideas to take your influences from, then you will have been drawing, taking photographs, doing sculptures, all the different mediums as you go along, but it is also important to experiment with different styles, even in like the final product stage. And then reflection, which to me is the most boring part and will forever be the most boring part. Because basically, reflection is thinking about what you've done and then telling people what you've done, which you will have been doing for the rest of the categories, but this is a more like regimented, like do it at the end of every day, do it at the end of every week sort of thing. And admittedly, if you don't like writing down things, you can submit a video diary, but that takes a while to edit and I wouldn't recommend it. And I wouldn't write a diary if I had the choice to not write a diary, but that's what you need to do. So, as an example of what a simple reflection might be, it could be, today I bought a woodless pencil and drew with it. And then a better reflection would be something about how it changed the way you drew things. Like, it requires more pressure, which means that you can't write with your fingers, you need to write with your wrist, which means that now you're not doing deliberate and precise movements and have been forced into, like, broad gestural strokes. And that's good, that's enough. Full marks, you get a distinction. And then the other side of reflection isn't the daily process by process bit, it's at the end of the entire thing, you evaluate, like you sum up what you've done, what your work has been working towards, if it worked, if it didn't. Same as artist reflection, where you're saying what works for you, what doesn't work for you, but now about your own work. So reflection is what you're doing and how you're doing it, and then evaluation is why you did it and why it works. It's as simple as that. That's the marking criteria. This is the end of part 1. And this is the start of part 2, where I'm going to show you through 6 of my sketchbooks and then some online stuff. Starting with the lens-based media books. The green one's a notebook and starts with an explanation of why the sketchbook exists and a description of the new project. I find repeating what you've heard lets it sink in better, writing it down even more so. And as a bonus, it shows you know the context you're working in and are planning accordingly. So the next few pages are also my notes on the project brief. Then this page has super scrappy notes on Henry Cartier-Bresson, which I can't even read, so I'll talk it through in the research bit of my sketchbook proper. Oh, and just because I have a notebook doesn't mean you have to. Doing this unnecessarily doubled my workload, and I did less of that in the future, but we've all got to find a system that works for us. And on this page there's a sketch of my final self-portrait idea, which means I get planning and evaluation points because it shows I've followed through on an idea, and the text above shows I've discarded a few others, evaluating that this is the best one. Which I've also done here, where I've written out a script for an idea. I eventually decided it wasn't worth anything though, and then on the next page I've got plans for how it would actually work in practice if I'd done it. Now, these pages are primary research for a flaneuring workshop where you'd find an environment and try to document it, draw from life, take photos, record audio, etc. And using rubbings as a further technique shows practical skills, which feeds back into the evaluation section, because if you've shown you can do something, it counts as a conscious decision when you then don't do that in the future. Use as many mediums as possible, basically. Have as many ideas as you can, and write them down. But the rest of this sketchbook is dull, so here's my sketchbook proper, which used to say, please watch my artist video contextless, before I ripped off the sellotape holding the USB with the audio, and my final artist videos. I'm showing you this one because it's by far the most organised, and on the first page you've got my tutor given targets alongside my own, which shows that I'm reflecting and evaluating and learning and etc. And they're mostly about presentation, so you've got that too. The rest of this book is repetition of what's in the previous one, so context, yada yada, then cyanotypes, which was a workshop given about how to use a new medium that I wrote up in detail and illustrated so that it'd go into my head better, and on the next page I've got reflection and evaluation. Everything went wrong, it's cool how the image is still visible but entirely different before you wash it, and I don't like the broken compositions of my final cyanotype, but it's good to see the contrast and what you can do with it, with pictures, because teachers bloomin' love pictures. Now here we've got Henry Cartier-Bresson where we can read him. I got the information I have here from a book in the library, so this is study and focused, and it's got an artist quote. Photography has not changed since its origin except in its technical aspects, which for me are not a major concern. Then his birth and death. He died in 2004 but only took black and white photos, I think to avoid the added complexity of colour, but then this also immediately declares itself to be art photography and to make it look old. I like that the photos are structured and have a clear focus. Despite being candid photographed, the camera is never tilted, which is harder than it looks. Cartier-Bresson's work is skillful enough to seem effortless. Two other things I like are his dedication to photography over the decades and his choice of subject. He aims to engender empathy with the disenfranchised, and that's great. And none of these are unique observations, none particularly deep, but they don't need to be either. I researched this one on the internet, and Bruce Nauman's entry is all punctum. Bruce Nauman is a weirdo who created a lot of stuff. Focusing on his video art, I don't like poke in the eye because all it's trying to do is evoke a reaction, and people empathetically feel discomfort is all I got from it. Good Boy Bad Boy, on the other hand, is an interestingly delivered piece of poetry. A woman that blinks too much and an overacting man that keeps referring to a script speak over each other in order to obscure the words being said, to overwhelm the viewer with contextless words delivered with phony emotion. That's interesting, and I'm not sure what's compelling about it, but it is compelling. And the final piece of research is on Catherine Yass. I attended a talk from her in the hall at UCA because artist talks are great, but I'm showing you this piece of research mostly to show how important responses to artists are. Her work is all analogue, but my response is digital. Hers are colourful, but mine is mostly grey, and she loses creative control to accidents, and I do not because Photoshop gives me that license, and I took as many photos as I wanted to. This shows that what I care about with Yass is the effect that she gets, the final product, a glowing aura and pulsating atmosphere, rather than the process, which she is so intent on saying is what's important about it. Responses to artists are good, and I've got arrows pointing to her own pictures to illustrate that influence, but what it shows is which aspects specifically that I care about, and which I don't. Moving on to idea development, I showed you the pencil sketch in the notebook. Now, here's how I've written that down proper. It's got an actual drawing and then some pictures of some different hairstyles to show I experimented, however slightly. And I'll remind you now that I write too much, and after the sketchbook I was told to write less, but explain more visually. And now the last thing in the sketchbook are the evaluations. It starts, I just really like my wire figures a lot of the time. I like the look of it, but I think that the meaning has been lost. It wouldn't have been possible to convey something so specific in a single photo, I suppose, but it's a shame. Perhaps unavoidable, but a shame nonetheless. And that explains my overall thoughts on the work of art. It does not convey its intent, but I like it. In the body of the evaluation, I write more specifically. The gremlin has personality, he appears to clamber. His left hand extends up to my eye in a triggered perspective and has more dominion of my face than the thin wire would literally allow. Of the sculpture itself, I like the man's hands on my shoulders, and the ones on my face are not well constructed, which was a design necessity to cover and grab more of my face and lips. And of my hair, because it is brushed, its lack of frizziness allows more of the sculpture to be seen, while also covering my headband very effectively, allowing the guy to seem to actually exist. And then I've done a little drawing at the bottom to illustrate how it creases my skin into a smile. And the evaluation of my artist video, which comes in two parts. The first saying that it is pure and perfect, so to evaluate it, you've got to think about whether it's worth anything. And then the second is a defense that it is worth anything. And so in the second evaluation, first I've written, this video is unique and that may be worthwhile on its own merit. And then on the second page, I've written, this video is a product of a new idea of what art is. It has abandoned intentionality in favour of something more interesting. As with Tacita Dean's 20-second video of failing to capture a solar eclipse, here the value is in the willingness to adapt, a value necessary for the creation of good art. Which is what I've done here. Adapt, not create good art. Even if it was, that wouldn't be for me to decide. And that's the end of the most organised book. Next we'll be moving on to fine art, which basically opens with a repetition of the project brief. This reinforces for me that I've got a task and shows the examiners that I know what it is. Then there's some research on Edgar Allan Poe because he was mentioned in a list of relevant artists, so I took a book from a library, wrote a few thoughts on some of his short stories, and tried to respond to them with an illustration. I say here that the horror of Poe comes from the inability to know thyself, which renders you powerless. That thought, in writing, is nowhere near as valuable as this drawing of a hanged cat. Then here, an example of idea development and planning. It's got some notes in the top right and an idea of scattered paper as a singular work, and while the majority of the placements were changed, that just shows experimentation and an ongoing evaluation as I fix what wasn't working. The following page is a write-up of a canvas structure making workshop and is reflection. It's also practical skills. Every time you do something new, that is practical skills. And this page is a couple of drawings of the finished works and small acknowledgements that they're not perfect. The drawings boil down what I think is essential to the ideas, but other than that, the evaluation is very simple. I don't like the face, and I don't like the flowchart. They're not explanations, they're just comments, which is alright, but it's not complete. I don't think anything worthwhile comes out without being iterated upon, so despite this being shallow, it was good to do before I improved on the attempt. The final piece of research in this book is a series of drawings drawn in the Royal Academy of Art exhibition on Spiliot. They are useful in the same way that I've been saying all drawings are, because without even a word you can tell that I'm dissolving my interest from what the figures represent to where the light is being focused to far more pure ideas of how the shade hits, what the forms are outside of lines, and how to represent that painting in pencil marks. This drawing of Picasso has returned to bold lines, showing an immediate contrast. And the final thing in this book at all is an evaluation which contrasts my work with the artists I went to see's work, and then a quick idea of how I may have made it differently if I was more directly inspired by the artist. But moving on to the sketchbook proper. And I made this sketchbook myself by stealing paper from the uni and sewing it together. Highly recommend. And the majority of what the book is artist research. This page on Monk, again, shows interpretation through drawing, but was based on reproductions of his work I found in a book from the library. Use the library is good. And on this page of planning, you can see that I've started on the idea of splitting an artwork over multiple pieces of paper before I'd even moved on to the second idea. Then this here drawing is based on Chuck Close's work, based on internet research, and exaggerates how impersonal I find Close to be as an artist. To steal some words from Merleau-Ponty, he reproduces a photograph as though it is a photograph, drawing a person almost as though by accident. So in my response here, I've accidentally missed out on the entire middle section of my face in the process of drawn reproduction. The next page talks about Close by quoting Grayson Perry. Perry says that Close is viewed by an audience on two levels. The first, visceral, the second, conceptual, and that regardless of whether you need both, it's nice that two people can enjoy the same work of art for entirely different reasons. At the end of this page, I write 4 things about my own drawing. 1. It looks cool. 2. The pen smudged, which is a shame. 3. The split in the face was an accident. And 4. The fact that an accident exists in such a structured approach proves the human element in transcribing photos. And then I relate it to Close's later work, and that is entirely different to what I think about it now, which again proves that drawing can say more than you ever can, and that you as an artist never know what actually it is you're saying, or what your appeal is at all. And while that's all well and good and pretentious, what you've got on this page is the laziest kind of criticism, pure comparison. On this page I've thrown 4 artists together in an attempt to describe how they've drawn the same subject, a face, in entirely different ways because they have entirely different motivations for doing so. Far more interesting than the writing are the images and the connections made between them without being made explicit, such as the identical poses. By dint of being in the same book, it also exists as a contrast with Chuck Close's approach, and I think that's pretty cool. Almost the last thing in the book is my writing about Spilliot, which is all studium, no emotion. Here I say, his use of India ink gives a very black or a grey with a grainy texture, depending on the amount it's been diluted. The paintings were in ink or watercolour, so the limited range of texture places a huge emphasis on the tone. Because his palette is so subdued, it is easy to be drawn in by the rare patches of light, and the patches of blue stood out in the self-portrait and the absinthe drinker's painting, because colour barely exists in his work. Followed by a bullet point list of facts: birth date, death date, country of origin, he's always sick, inspired by Monk and Edgar Allan Poe, illness stopped him from completing a fine arts course in Bruges, and it's interesting the way that the exhibition didn't show any of his later, more colourful work, so that they could sell the idea of a torched artist, a recluse, and glorify his isolation. Then, the final bit in this book is feedback on my art. Criticism from others is the most valuable thing. You should cherish them, and also write it down, so that's what I've done here. And as we move on to my final proper sketchbook, still 2 more notebooks and some online stuff, I want to reiterate that it's not actually possible to be smart, just good with words or making connections, which, when displayed, is more impressive than it is smart. So the connection or contrast I'm making on this page is between Monk and Mondrian, which I've then tried to illustrate on the page, and then I painted my own versions of these ideas, which is pretty good, I think. Research and evaluation and etc. Then, on these pages, well, first there's a not very good drawing, but I planned it in some notebook, I'll show now, and that's important and also proves that everything progresses with iteration. But on the other page, I've drawn some nice screenshots from Anna Mantzaris's films and found a through line between them. The ending of the first short film may seem optimistic, but when seen in the context of her second film, But Milk is Important, it is shown that human connection in disconnected societies or people is brief and immediately abandoned. The character returns to their isolated existence, and I imagine the same would be true of the first, were it allowed to continue. This is a reflection page. It explains what I did that day, which drawing I liked the most, the process of cyanotypes and photograms, and that Dragonframe is a stop-motion animation program, and the steps required to set up a blank file. I then state my influences for the animation, Louis Brunel and Laura Gall. And this is a page on Suspiria, where I mentioned the 3 things that I like the most about the film, the most important of which is how it uses the fact that the camera movements tend to be motivated to create suspense, and very often without paying that suspense off. I enjoyed watching it, but the reason it's relevant is that it's a horror movie, and I wanted to create a horror short film, And on the final page we've got some spirals, which I think speak for themselves. Now, the associated sketchbook, where I have ideas that I didn't put into the proper one. This one came to nothing, but it's good to show anyway. It's evaluation, even if you assess it to be worth nothing. These ones also didn't become a finished product, though I did draw the final backgrounds and might have storyboarded it. This page, I hated being in that specific workshop, so I drew a man smiling widely and crying. Hey look, documentation, great. Also, I hate you. This is the way notebooks have to work for me. You can find your own methods of hating your teachers, but I do like this guerrilla artist drawing. Yeah. And the final thing here from the carousel now is planning for a Rube Goldberg machine, which I'll show you now on my UCA blog. Here. I quite like it, but I prefer the way that I've set it up on the blog. See, I first explained what I think of them, masculine and useless, constructed a pastiche, decided parody is pointless, embarked on creating a real one, showing the failed first version, and then finally showing a proper final video which uses editing and such to explain the work rather than to show it. It's then got a drawing I quite like of it, before reducing the whole thing back to ridicule by showing the outtakes, which I'll think you'll agree is a better criticism than the first version was. I've not done much evaluating here, but on this one, in Lensbase I have, but it would be boring to read it out, so I'm just going to tell you how I made it. I looked at the piece of art I made, and then I wrote down what came to mind. I like this quote. It says, "I had to duct tape a knife to a door." Then, on this page, I've tried to keep putting the glasses from the stamps into new context to see what works, which is experimentation. And that idea of recontextualization is seen here too, where I've edited video. It's surrounded by text claiming the opposite and saying that I've actually just properly contextualized them. It shows the strength of each performer, which is a ridiculous statement, but hey, I like the video. Now, finally for this project, I'm going to show you my response to two artists. With Brace Girdle, it's more interesting to talk about than replicate, because looking at it, you've got to wonder what intent even is, when she's done nothing but remove enough that she's still showing what was once there. And that's interesting, especially since it brings the photograph back to pure materiality without removing the emphasis on what's being shown. But when you make one yourself, you don't care about that any more than when you just look at it. Then Marlo Pasquale has a cool disruption of photos that I can't comment on, but here's my response. I think it's more fun to look at than talk about or think about. And moving on to the next project, what we have online is generic reflection, saying what I did, showing it, and moving on. We've got evaluation. I like the video I've made, but none of what I like in it is mine. It is artistically bankrupt. If art is a process of understanding, then I have created non-art. That's mad somehow. Not good, but mad. And above that I've got a nice GIF on how the effects are layered atop one another. Here we've got some honest-to-God documentation of progress, including some nice images of me measuring the cross I'm using. And before I finish off the internet section with some artist research, I'm going to say, hey, collaborate with people around you. It's good to do. I made this video here in collaboration with Molly, and it's the best thing I've done. And it's because you've got two competing ideas coming out and enriching the work. That's why this page on cleanliness is also the best research I've done. It sets up two competing ideas and sees what each does differently to discover how and why which works and what's worth more. Katrina suggested it, and she did so because it's a good idea. Here specifically, I've got Kondo against Picasso, and say that Chodsko is cleaner because he's painting art, whereas Picasso is painting reality. So it's messy, but it's richer. Then this page has terrible research because I wasn't interested in the artist I was looking at, but I just want to show you this really funny image because it's a man who, so seriously inspired by Buddhism, wants to compel you to peace. The work is called Zen for Head, and he had another one called Zen for Film, which is a blank movie, and the hope is that you come to a deeper understanding of experience. But with this one, the way he's done that is to dip his head in paint and then drag it across the floor, and I think that's just, really funny. Now, this is the final book I'm showing you. Final thing too, because even though I made a video diary alongside this, I can't pick out things that are more or less important. It's all just ongoing reflection. In this book, we've got planning, a script for a video with something of a shot list. Then I made the video, then evaluated it. Pros, it is an exorcism. It has my most involved sound design to date. Ooh, acting. Close up on face and eyes. And cool subtitles. The cons, it refers to meaning not in the work, a la Ashlyn Evans. I jumble a mess of words into a carefully edited nothingness. The scene does not earn it. It purposefully does not cohere without serving a purpose. Maya Deren was right, this is style without reason. I've also got a note on Goethe, because I was reading it and everything you read folds into your work. Then some notes on a wheezing man idea, which then becomes words before returning to clean storyboards. It eventually became this. More planning. To-do lists are a godsend to me, but they may not work for you. Here we've got more storyboards. This one for teeth, which became this. Then the rest of the book is just more planning, which I won't show you because you've got to come up with your own system, and mine aren't pristine and ideal. But I will show you my final evaluations. This one, for the game I made, again, what worked for me was to look at my art and write out what came to mind. I tried to sum it up, then crush it, then expand it back into something that means everything to me, but only something to someone else. And it looks like this, but I'm not going to read it out. What I will read out is my final evaluation for the entire project, and that sounds like this. What has this project accomplished? I don't know. I've not seen it in the context of my past yet. That's one of the realizations I've come to. Nothing is contextless. People are worthless but for their communication with others. I am worthless working as an auteur. That's why I'm going off to do an animation degree, because you can't pretend that animation is a lone effort. Animation is a collaboration. And it is far more important to learn how to work with others than to, as Zachary Obazan says, perfect a voice that doesn't pay. While Obazan's voice is incredible in how it shines through in his work, his full glory comes from its history and the connections and juxtapositions he manages to forge. An Oscar Wilde short story collection has constant endnotes quoting similar ideas in his later works, commenting on his unacknowledged self-plagiarism. Repetition is keeping an idea and moving it into different contexts. By reusing the same symbols, stutters, comments on ego, talk of fathers and being enough, I am screaming, it is not enough that it exists, we must look at it. That's what art is, I guess. Creating something that definitely means something, and hoping that no one agrees on what it is. My game started off as a Bible before I realised that I didn't believe in authority and to be didactic requires it, and that the Bible coasts fairly heavily on having God's signature on it. It is my plunge into making games, a medium hinging on interaction. It was an attempt born of the simple belief that everything you see is made by people, and that it is all so simple. And while that's true, what makes them worthwhile is that they manage to stack so much simplicity atop itself until you are in awe of its beauty. Molly Clark, who I really can't speak highly enough of, showed this to me as she created something quite good and then something else fairly interesting before expanding and reworking them 50 times and combining them into something genuinely magical. If we take for granted the annihilation of the self while keeping the idea of value in how we communicate, that's where we might get something interesting. That's why my game's subject matter, while nominally contained on a room-to-room basis, bleeds all over. Books are mother's death, marriage, missing, looking, smoking, stutters. There's quite a bit of overlap there, and having symbols lead to utterly different outcomes shatters the dream of generalised ideas. A stutter is in all cases a stumbling block leading to a revelation, but because each revelation is so different, it means both be true to yourself and trust in the once glorious, which just means don't trust self-propelled logic, or you are not immune to propaganda. And connections like that can be made anywhere. I can't know if an audience would care enough to trace any of this. I couldn't worry about that while I was making it, which is what allowed me to make it. But I still took care in making it interesting. If a scene is dull, it can be left. My next major project will be emphasising concise communication, because while I got a lot out of it, killed my ego, can't be an artist, I will need my art to give something to others too. My thoughts be bloody, or be nothing worth. Hamlet said that. And I think that's a good evaluation, because they're all words I wouldn't and couldn't have said before I started the project. But that's the end of the sketchbook tour. Part 3, advice. And here's my advice. Think big and broad. Only create art that is necessary to make, even if it's only necessary to yourself. Do as much as you can do or want to. Use the library. The library's great. Filled with books. You can take books off the shelves. Books are better than Wikipedia because you need to read them like 4 times before you can put them online. It's not actually about the people on Wikipedia not being as smart as people who are writing books. It's about the people who are writing books need to put in a lot more time and effort, which means that what you get by the end of the book creating process is something quite a lot more direct and comprehensive than anything you could ever get from the internet. And if you're worried about how to use the library, firstly, they'll tell you. Secondly, in pre-COVID times, you walk in, you use one of the computers there to type in the title of your book. It gives you a Dewey Decimal Code. You find that area of the library. You take your book, you take it to a scanner, you scan your card on the thing, put your book underneath the thing, and then you can just leave. And you don't even need to talk to a single person. And then in post-COVID times or during COVID times, you have to find it on the internet. You click on 4 things, you find the thing, and you type in the name of the book, you place a hold, and then you'll get an email saying, okay, your books are ready. And then you walk into the library and you say, hello, can I do the NHS track and trace thing? They go, yep. And you go, where are the books? And they point at the books, and then you find your name. And it's normally alphabetical. And then you can leave, which means you only need to talk to one person, which is worse than it was before, but still, books are cool. And then I'd recommend you read the following 4 essays, which I will link to in the description, which are On Criticism by Goethe, and it's 3 pages long. On Style in the Medium of Motion Pictures, which is by Erwin Panofsky, and it's 10 pages long. Chapter 1 of Ways of Seeing, which I don't like, but John Berger is famous. And then Cézanne's Doubt by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, which is 10 pages long, but incredibly difficult to read, but also very, very good. And you get to hear about how Leonardo got a vulture tail in his mouth when he was a baby.